and we shall begin. So this session is on strategies and routines for our multilingual learners to consolidate their learning. And we'll be mostly talking about how cognitive science can help us in the classroom to establish certain strategies, routines, to ensure that what we teach will be long-term learning and will not be forgotten. A little bit about me. My name is Iryna Zhurenko. I am originally from Ukraine, but have been living in China since 2006 with my husband here and 3 cats. I've been an educator for 17 years, and most of my experience has been in the classroom as a homeroom teacher, EAL teacher. I've also been a curriculum coordinator and teacher leader. But because I am a speaker of 4 languages myself, the EAL world is near and dear to me, and what our learners go through, I can relate a lot. So what will be presented today in today's workshop is the strategies, routines that we can establish in the classroom for our younger learners. And those strategies and routines are backed up by what cognitive science teaches us about how learning happens. I love reading biographies, driving, despite what they say about driving in Asia, and all sorts of escape quests. That's a lot of fun, always. So, an inclusion for today for all of us. Have you seen this movie, The 51st Dates? If you have, can you give me a thumbs up? If not, thumbs down. Yes. So it's a comedy film released in 2004, and it follows the story of Henry, who falls in love with an art teacher named Lucy. And when he discovers she has amnesia and forgets him a day later, he resolves to win her again and again, each new day. So another question to you: have you ever felt like Henry, trying to repeat yourself over and over again so that your students remember? Yeah, yes. So that was a little bit of an that was the inspiration for today's topic for me, the 51st dates, that oftentimes we do feel like Henry, trying to repeat ourselves often and not sure why students cannot remember. So today we will look at some research and strategies, hopefully, that we can apply in the classroom that maybe will help our students remember. So the content objective for us is how we can apply cognitive science in the classroom to help multilingual learners consolidate their language learning. Our conversation today will be about strategies and retrieval practices that can be used in the classroom, and why it's important, because hopefully after today's session, we will have an understanding of how cognitive science principles can help us plan intentionally for learning that is joyful, but also long-lasting. Colloquials, content language culture objective is something that we use a lot at International School of Beijing. That's the school I am representing today at our also PD Day. So when we look at language learning, we mostly look at it through the lens of pedagogical practice. When we talk about scaffolding, visual organizers, we look at it through the lens of linguistics. When we talk about oracy, literacy, grammatical structures, phonemic awareness, and all of that. And also we often look at it through the lens of psychology and talk about the social emotional aspect of learning, motivation, anxiety, and how it affects learning. And in these conversations, there is often an important piece missing, and that is neuroscience. So today, we will look at how neuroscience research and practices can inform our teaching and make our time in the classroom hopefully more productive. So I'd like to start with this, that neuroscience tells us that our brain is a plastic organ that changes during learning. And there are changes to both the structure and the function of the brain. And these changes are different depending on whether the learning is surface learning or deep learning. So surface learning is learning that involves recalling and reproducing of content. And with surface learning, memory retrieval happens through previously established or existing pathways. With deep learning, new neural pathways are developed, and this happens when learning, when students are applying knowledge and skills in new contexts. So when we're seeing words like applying, new contexts, we think that, yeah, that's the learning we want to be happening in the classroom, right? We want our students to have deep learning. And surface learning, unlike deep learning, is often perceived as something negative. And John Hattie in his book suggests that, yeah, around 90% of classroom teaching is focused around surface learning. So obviously we should be aiming towards deeper learning. But an important understanding for us educators is that we actually need both. Surface learning and deep learning are both bits of a continuum. Just like this iceberg here, surface learning is on the surface, but deeper learning is at the bottom, and we can't get to that bottom part unless the surface learning has happened. Repetition, memorization, which are important parts of surface learning, are important steps to deeper learning. And we will now explain why, how so. Our brain is very fascinating and complex, much like human learning. So one neuroscientific concept, brain plasticity, has been the subject of significant interest that has informed research about education. Brain plasticity, it's the capacity of the brain to modify its connections or to reorganize itself through a person's lifetime. And the classic form of plasticity operates at the synapse, the tiny gap between the nerve cells across with neurotransmitter, where neurotransmitters pass. So if one nerve cell fires and activates another neuron in the chain, and that happens repeatedly, there will be a stronger relationship between those two cells. And if the pattern of firing is infrequent or random, then these neurons don't fire together in the future. So this plasticity is two-sided. One side greases the wheels for things that do happen often, while the other side does the opposite. So if things don't happen often, then these connections become weaker. There's a catchy saying about this, that neurons that fire together, wire together, and neurons out of sync lose their link. So without this surface learning and repetition of content and skills, we can't get to that deeper learning. So let's see what actually happens if students are not exposed to a certain content or skill frequently enough for these neural pathways to become strong enough. It is an unfortunate fact, first spotted by Ebbinghaus in 1885. We may have heard about him. Give me a thumbs up if you have. That we have not only a learning curve where people take time to learn, but also a forgetting curve where we lose what we learn if we don't use it regularly. Now, since 1895, that was a long time ago, and a lot of new research has appeared since then. And there's been a lot of research in favor or against this theory, as well as about the factors that affect our ability to remember what we learned. And yes, individual differences, prior knowledge, importance, personal importance of content can make this curve go steeper or not. But the main idea remains undisputed. If the learner is not exposed to new information more than once, then the amount of information retained declines over time, and you can see how. That within 20 minutes, we may potentially only remember 58% of what we taught, what has been taught. And without repetition or second or third time being exposed to that same content, we will remember only 20% of that same content after 30 days. So that's bad news. The good news is we can beat the forgetting curve. And hopefully we will learn how today. So a learning method that helps beat it was developed by neuroscientist Dr. Paul Kelly, and that's a great book, in my opinion. Making Minds, his book, in his work, Making Minds, What's Wrong with Education and what should we do about it? He writes about the importance of spreading the learning of the most important concepts over months and returning to them periodically to build and reinforce. So going back to those words, repetition and memorization, which causes many educators to frown. If students are not exposed to vocabulary, sentence structures, or given an opportunity to practice a skill, much of it will be forgotten. But there is actually, so the question is, how often do we need to expose students to content we want them to learn? Or how often do we need them to ask to practice a certain skill so that they remember? So in response to forgetting curve, there's been developed also a curve with time. How often do we need to repeat certain content recommendations so that we retain information? So ideally, we need to plan for opportunities to revisit whatever we have taught: vocabulary, grammar structures, skill, sentences. We need to plan to revisit it immediately after class, then 24 hours later, 1 week later, and 1 month later. And all of this you can find in Dr. Paul Kelly's book. So he gives additional recommendations on how to incorporate these mini reviews and check-ins. And there's research and examples of how revisiting, let's say, a list of vocabulary words. You have a list of 10 words, 3 times in one lesson with 10-minute breaks increases the likelihood of students remembering those vocabulary words significantly. So in 2 sentences, if you repeat something with the students 3 times in one lesson, and then 5 times in a monthly period, the chances of them remembering what you're trying to teach them will grow significantly higher. Now, we continue exploring what other insights cognitive science can offer us, and we'll look at the multi-store model of memory. I'm sure you have heard a lot about short-term memory, long-term memory, maybe also sensory memory, and know that something that is learned can be retrieved if if it's stored in the long-term memory. So to understand how we can get the information we want our students to remember into the long-term memory, we need to look at how these 3, sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory, work together. So as you can see from this picture, students initially perceive auditory and visual information and store it temporarily in their sensory registers. Then if attended to by each student, this information is moved into what's called short-term memory for processing. But short-term memory is, as given from the name, short. Even though it's short, it's still an important step on the route to forming a long-term memory. But the problem is it only holds a limited amount of information and for only short periods of time. And depending on how it's processed in this short-term memory, it may or may not be moved into long-term memory for storage and later use, which is where we want it to be. So to understand better how it works, I know this may be basic knowledge, we'll do an experiment. I'm gonna give you a number and then ask you to close your eyes and try and remember it. See if you can remember the order of digits in this line. So 573062. You might have to repeat it out loud. You might have, you may have to like look at it for some time. Now close your eyes and see if you can remember it. Yeah, so that was pretty easy to remember it, right? Were you able to remember it? Give me a thumbs up if you were. Now, if we wait another minute, you will also notice that it has begun to fade from your short-term memory already, unless you've rehearsed it in some way, like maybe 3 times with those 10-minute gaps. Now, I'm going to give you another line of digits. Go ahead to try and remember this one. See if you can work out a pattern, a strategy, how many times you have to repeat it out loud to remember it. 2118229. So give me a thumbs up if you even feel like it's possible, or you would have to practice a lot. Yeah, it was probably impossible for most of you to remember that one, right? So, and that's the thing about short-term memory. It can hold only about 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. Short-term memory has limited capacity, and there is a law to what that capacity is. And in cognitive science, it's called Miller's law, which means that your short-term memory can only hold 7 plus minus 2 chunks of independent information. And if it's more than that, so more than 9 or more than 5 for some younger learners, then your short-term memory becomes overloaded, and it becomes nearly impossible or will require a lot of effort to remember more digits, items of information, vocabulary words, or let's say ideas in a lesson that you teach. So what implications does this law have for our teaching in the classroom? Only that we have to carefully consider the number of units of information we want our students to learn in one lesson. This, in a way, explains why rolling out 20 or more new words for language support before we teach a new unit is not effective. This law explains why students will only be able to remember only 7 plus minus 2 words from the list of 20, or they may not even try to remember them at all, because just like with the longer line of digits, it was very demotivating for you, and you saw no pattern, you saw no order. This law doesn't mean that we shouldn't teach more than 7 words at all from a unit, but it just means that going beyond 7 plus minus or 2 new vocabulary words in one lesson may be a little bit too much and counterproductive. So that's another routine that we can, I guess, derive from this rule, that when we plan our lessons, even if it's 45 minutes long, we may not want to include too many skills, points, ideas, words, units of information that we want our learners to learn. So let's do another experiment. What comes to mind when I say the word friend? Take some time to think. So some may think what it means to be a friend. Some may think about who are my friends and how do I know it? Who are my best friends, right? So my question initially caused you to think about the meaning of the word. Now, what if I ask you to process the word in a different way. I could ask you to count how many letters there are in this word. Can you show me with your fingers? Like 6, right? I could also ask you to count the vowels and consonants. I could ask you to spell it backwards or arrange the letters in alphabetical order. So with the first example, when I asked you to think about the meaning of the word, you had probably a dynamic network of associations and connections, and you were processing word in a deeper way. And if I asked, with the second example, when I ask you to count the letters, vowels, consonants, in cognitive science understanding, you were processing the word in a shallower way. And you will probably be much less likely to later remember that friend was that word I asked you about 10 minutes later, if we only go with the second way. So, which we often do that when we ask our students to learn high frequency words. We ask them to look at the vowels, the consonants, the digress, whether the word is tall or short, without actually thinking about the meaning of the word. Now, let's do another example. If I give you the list of 10 words which are on the right, and only that list of 10 words, would you be able to remember them? You could probably do it, but you won't be able to recall this list tomorrow because the words are really random, like car and map, police and blue, cable, top. There is no logical order between them. Now, on the contrary, if you try and create a picture in your imagination with the given words, like here we see there's a map and a car and police officer and a top on the rope on the cable. This picture, regardless of how ridiculous it is, it makes sense, right? So if you create a picture in your imagination with the given words, there will be a good chance you will remember these words even a week from now. So these two examples, the word friend and then random words, but then with a picture with the given words, they bring us to an understanding that for us to transfer knowledge from short-term memory to long-term memory, we have to make our students to think to learn. Students remember what they've been thinking about. So in terms of our memory model, this means supporting the dialogue between working memory and long-term memory. And the more we get students to cognitively process what it is we want them to learn, the more they'll be likely to recall and use it later. To support this idea, I'd like you to leave with this quote that by Daniel Willingham, that memory is the residue of thought. This quote is about creating opportunities in the classroom for dialogue between short-term memory and long-term memory to happen. We need to make our students to think about what they learn, whether it's one word, a list of words, a sentence structure, or a text. We have a workshop later in the day about visible thinking routines. So that is in a way about that too. That's where visible thinking routines become very effective. Now, the last experiment for today, I promise, try and answer these questions in your mind. Like, how do you spell your name? We'll probably be able to do that. Or who is the current president of the United States? You know, how many sides to a triangle? How many planets are in our solar system? What did you have for breakfast today? Who is your best friend? And so on. So each of these questions you no doubt answered with with different degrees of quickness and certainty. Some you were able to retrieve almost instantly, like how many sides to a triangle. With some, it took you longer to find in your memory, right? That is because answering these questions required different types of retrieval cues. Cognitive science differentiates two types of retrieval cues: cued recall and then free recall. Cued recall is any specific visual or verbal cue provided to elicit a memory. That's when you ask a very specific question. What is this? What color is this? That's a cued recall. Free recall is a cue that is much less specific. For example, when you ask your students to summarize or share the most important ideas from a text, a lesson, or a unit. Or even if you ask a very broad question, just what is this about? Which, let's be honest, most often when checking for understanding, we use cued recall. We ask very specific questions about very specific content that we have taught. But free recall is a lot harder to do. And cued recall, which can be in the form of a direct question or multiple choice question, does not work for long-term effective learning. And I'll explain now why. Free recall is a lot harder to do, and it simply takes more work to search your memory and to respond to those general sorts of cues. And the cognitive effort required with this free recall, when you ask a very general question like, what is it about? Not only modifies in more specific and organized way prior memory being recalled, but it also allows the learner to develop retrieval cues for that memory. So when students are making a free recall, the effort that they make creates a lot more new neural pathways in their brain than cued recall. So how do we incorporate this understanding of retrieval practice in our teaching? It's actually fairly simple. We need to practice retrieval whenever we can, both in and out of class. But when at the end of a lesson, when we create exit tickets with lots of questions, we can limit that to only one question. What did you learn today? And the effort, all the knowledge that the students will have to gather to answer that question from the cognitive science perspective will create learning that is more long-lasting than with acute recall. So I know we only have a couple minutes left, like 2. Today we talked about the forgetting curve and the need for frequent repetition and application of content. We talked about the Miller's law and the 7 plus or minus 2 units of information. We talked about why visible thinking routines are effective and how memory is the residue of thought. We also talked about how free recall is more effective than cued recall. So if you'd like, you're welcome to leave in the chat box today if there's something that stuck with you today and maybe something that you'd like to try in the classroom, or something that you'd like to think more about when lesson planning, let's say next week. And as you're thinking, I'd like to also say that during our session today, I've referenced 2 courses, one from the University of Queensland called Deep Learning Through Transformative Pedagogy, and one from Teachers College, Columbia University, The Science of Learning, and I recommend both. The creators of the courses resourced a wealth of cognitive science research that can reshape the way we approach teaching and planning. So you're welcome to leave your comments in the chat box. And If you'd like to connect and stay in touch for the future, here is my email and my LinkedIn profile. You're welcome to connect. Would be happy to connect. All right. Thank you very much for your feedback and comments. Thank you for joining me today. Looking forward to meeting you in other sessions today. Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.